Hello everyone, welcome to the 9th session on photography. So as you all know, I've been conducting a series of photography workshops. So this is the 9th in the series. So let's wait a couple of minutes for a few people to join. Just give me a few seconds for me to set up. Okay, I see that there are a good number of people online already. So hi Prakriti, hi Ananta Prabhu, yeah, and hi Anil. So great to see you all online again. Like I was saying, I've been conducting a series of workshops on photography, and so this is the 9th in the series. And in case you have missed any of the previous sessions, you can check them out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Neeta Shankar. So all the sessions up to today have been already uploaded on that. So do have a look. So yesterday we talked about basics of fundamentals of photography, which is the exposure triangle. So we started talking about exposure triangle. So we talked about what is exposure. We tried to understand aperture and how it affects light and depth of field. We discussed various topics. So I was thinking about it yesterday after the session, and I figured in these small sessions it's actually difficult to cover a lot of stuff. So today I'll try and simplify the next topic as much as possible so that you are able to understand better. And then if you want to learn further, or if you want to understand the whole concept in depth, probably you can attend one of our the more in-depth workshops once the lockdown is lifted. So yesterday we talked about aperture and exposure. So first of all, we understood what is exposure. Just doing a quick recap for people who weren't present yesterday. So exposure is nothing but the amount of light that enters your camera through the opening in your lens and is let inside the camera for a certain duration of time, which is your shutter speed, and is captured on your sensor. So exposure is nothing but the amount of light that enters the camera for a certain length of time and to record an image. So exposure basically depends on three factors. That is your aperture, which is the size of the opening in your lens. So that determines how much of light is entering your lens, and your shutter speed, which gives your determines how much of light actually falls on the sensor. Out of all the light that is entering the camera, how much of light actually falls on your sensor, that is determined by your shutter speed. Apart from that, the third factor that influences exposure is your ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. So we talked about how aperture controls light and also depth of field yesterday. So again, a quick recap. So aperture is nothing but the diameter of the opening in your lens, and it is denoted by the fraction focal length by f number. So f number are the numbers that are on the back of your camera, the second parameter that you're allowed to change. Make sure you are on manual mode so that you see all these numbers. So if you start changing these numbers in your camera, you will see that you see numbers like 1.8, 2, 2.8, 3.2, 4, 4.5, 5.6, like that. You see various numbers, right? So these are all f-stops or f numbers that you can set to control the size of the opening in your lens. So since aperture is denoted by f by n, where f is your focal length and n is the f number, so remember basic mathematics. So since n is in the denominator, so the smaller the f number that you set in your lens, the bigger the opening in your lens would be. So that would mean that more light enters your camera if you set your f number to a small value. If you set your f number to a higher value, like maybe f16 or f22, your lens, the opening in your lens would be very, very small and very little light enters your camera. So it's as simple as that. That's how aperture controls light. And we also learned that smaller the f number, like 1.8 or 2, 2.8, such small numbers ensure that the depth of field is really shallow, that is your background is out of focus and your only your subject is in focus. So you get more shallower depth of field if you are shooting with a wide open aperture, that is if you are shooting with an f number that is really, really small. As you increase your f number, as you increase it to say 5.6, 8 or 11 or 16, your depth of field starts increasing and your the sharpness, the area of sharpness in your image starts increasing. So these sort of values are recommended if you're shooting landscapes or architecture where you want focus from end to end. Whereas if you want focus on a particular subject and you want the background out of focus, you have to keep your f number really low. So just remember that f number, whatever the f number you set will determine how much of light is entering your camera. The smaller the value, more the light entering the camera, and your depth of field will be really shallow. Higher the f number, less light is entering your camera and your depth starts increasing. So just remember that much, and we'll go ahead and understand shutter speed. So yesterday we also went through the camera, how the camera works, and like I said, when you are taking a picture, the light enters, whatever light is reflected off your subject. Now let's say this is my subject, whatever light is reflected off this subject enters my camera through the opening in my lens, and it is allowed to fall on the sensor to capture that image by using the shutter. The minute you press the shutter button, the shutter opens up. In case of a DSLR camera, the mirror snaps up and then the shutter opens up. In case of mirrorless camera, there is no mirror, so the shutter opens up and then the light falls on your sensor and it records the image. So shutter speed is basically how long your shutter remains open and how long the light is allowed to fall on your sensor. So obviously if the shutter speed is long, say imagine you've set your shutter speed to something like 5 seconds or 10 seconds, it's a really long shutter speed, right? So a lot of light is entering your camera. And conversely, if your shutter speed is really fast, like say 1/2000th of a second, so imagine 1 second itself is really small, whereas 1/2000th of a second is obviously a really fast shutter speed. So very little light is entering your camera, right? So let's understand how shutter speed affects the picture. So shutter speed controls the duration for which the sensor is exposed to light. It is measured in seconds or a fraction of second depending on what your shutter speed is. So it could be something like 1/8000, 1/4000, 1/1000. It could be 1/100th of a second, or it could be a half second, or it could be a second, or it could be 10 seconds. Whatever it is that you're setting the shutter speed in your camera. Okay, my dog is here. Varun, I ran out of battery in this. Can you get me a replacement? Okay, so shutter speed is basically the first value that you see in your camera, and you would see a fraction or you could see a number. So depending on different cameras, they display in different formats. Okay, so let's understand different stops. Yesterday we also talked about stops in aperture. So let me not complicate it too much. I don't want to explain too much about stops because it's actually difficult to explain this in an online session where I'm just sitting in front of the screen. If it would be a lot easier if you all had your cameras with you, and then I could easily explain and demonstrate. But anyways, so like I said, stop is a unit of light. It's a measurement for light. So if I say I increase the stop, that means that I doubled the light that is entering the camera. If I say I decreased the stop, that means I cut the light by half. So let's say you are at 1 second shutter speed, and if you want to increase the light that is falling on your sensor, you would move to 2 seconds, right? It's fairly simple. So if you want to move up a stop, you will move to 2 seconds. Now if you wanted to instead decrease a stop, so instead of 1 second you bring it down to half a second. So that is like decreasing your stop. So let me just quickly change the battery. Okay, so like I said, shutter speed is the first value that you see, and you can if you change it, you can see say if it's set at 1 by 100, you can change it to 1 by 125, 1 by 160, 1 by 200, 1 by 250, 1 by 320. So these are all basically the measure of shutter speed. So these are all basically stops and intermediate stops. So if you consider from like 1 second, say 1 by 2, 1 by 4, 1 by 8, 1 by 15, 1 by 30, 1 by 60, 1 by 125. So as you can see, from 1 second we are like cutting it down to half second, then to 1/4 of a second, to 1 by 8th of a second, 1 by 15th of a second, like that. So we are basically cutting the duration by half, and as you increase, you can increase it to like 2 second, 4 second, 8 second, and things like that. So always know that in camera there is also something called intermediate stops. Varun is coming near the camera. Okay, so my dog is walking around here and I'm scared that he'll knock out my camera again like he did last time. So yeah, so like I was saying, cameras also display intermediate stop. So you may not always see the full stop. There will also be 1/3 stop and 2/3 stop in between, so that in case you want to make a slight difference, instead of doubling the light, if you want to just make a slight difference, you can use the 1/3 stop or 2/3 stop. So don't get confused. The full stops would be different from the intermediate stops, but the easy way to go about it is each full stop is has 3 intermediate stops in it, right? So you can just count 3 times when you're changing the shutter speed. Let's say you're at 1 by 400 and I change it once, it becomes 1 by 500, twice it becomes 1 by 640, and thrice is 1 by 800. So you know that if 1 by 400 was the initial value, if you want to increase by 1 stop, it should ideally become, if you want to decrease by 1 stop, it should ideally become 1 by 800. So I had to do it thrice to get to that level, because like I said, there are intermediate stops in your camera for your benefit. So every time you change your value in your camera thrice, you're increasing or decreasing 1 stop. So you're shifting 1 stop by changing your the value thrice in your camera. So just remember that. Okay, so going ahead, Like I said, shutter speed influences light, which is pretty straightforward. So because shutter speed is the duration for which your sensor is exposed to light. So if you reduce the duration or increase the duration, it is obviously affecting the amount of light that is captured. So apart from light, shutter speed also influences motion. So we'll understand that here. So if you have set your camera to a really fast shutter speed, so fast shutter speeds would be something like 1/1000th of a second or 1/500th of a second, which is like a really tiny fraction of a second. So if your camera is exposed to light only for that fraction of a second, that's called a fast shutter speed. Whereas the slow shutter speeds would be when you have a longer exposure, like 1 second, 2 second, 4 second, anything like that. So what's fairly straightforward is if your shutter speed is really fast, obviously the light entering your camera is really low, and if your shutter speed is really low, as in really long, then the light entering your camera is a lot more. So that's pretty straightforward. So like I said, the shutter speed affects motion. Like how I said aperture affects your light as well as depth of field, in the same way shutter speed controls light as well as motion. So what I mean by motion is, now I'm sure you would have seen a lot of pictures where you try to take a picture of a running child and the kid appeared really blurred out because the kid was running and you just couldn't manage to get a sharp shot of the child, right? So you would have come across situations like that. That's because your shutter speed is slow compared to the speed of the child. So if you want to freeze a subject, if you want to freeze the motion of your subject, then you need to have a really fast shutter speed. So let's say there are some birds flying in the sky and I want to freeze that. I would use a fast shutter speed, like at least 1/200th of a second or 1/500th of a second, whatever is possible for me. Now, likewise, if I'm shooting fast moving subjects like kids or pets or whatever, I would use a fast shutter speed. Now, certain times you may also want to use slower shutter speeds because you want to blur out the motion. So if you want to blur out the motion, you will have to use a shutter speed that is appropriate for that situation, for whatever is the speed of your subject or speed of the motion that you want to blur out. So let's look at some examples. Say in this scenario, because I wanted to freeze the fast wave that came in and I wanted to freeze all those droplets. I don't know if you're able to see the image in the, yeah, you should be able to see. Okay, so if you want to freeze all those droplets of the ocean, then you would want to use a really fast shutter speed, because otherwise you can't really freeze that fast motion, right? So this was shot at something like 1/1000th of a second. Likewise here I have taken a picture of this where I was pouring the drink, and you see all these little droplets that have flown out. So I wanted all these droplets to be frozen in time. So basically I'm freezing the motion and I want everything to be sharp. So in such a case, again, I would shoot a really fast shutter speed. So something like 1/500 at least, preferably faster than that, like 1/1000 to freeze each and every individual droplet, right? And another reason when you would want to use a fast shutter speed, another reason is so that you can avoid any sort of camera shake. So like I said, now let's say you're shooting fast moving subjects like kids or pets, and they are moving too fast for you to freeze them. You need to increase your shutter speed. Also, sometimes what happens is you may not get a sharp enough subject if you end up shaking your camera. Like when you're taking the picture, if your hand shakes and if you are on a very slow shutter speed, then this minor shake in your camera can also get recorded and your subject can appear blurred out. So many people keep asking me throughout the session, one constant question that I've been getting is, how do I get sharp images? So there is a rule of hand holding your camera. So if you're shooting handheld, then there is a rule that you need to follow. That is, if you, let's say, imagine this is a 50 mm lens and you're shooting you're shooting a moving subject, or even a still subject for that matter. When you want to ensure that no camera shake is captured, that is, even if, let's say, while taking the picture I just move the camera a little bit, like everyone does it, it is some people have steadier hands, but like I have really steady hands, so I can shoot a little slower shutter speeds and get away with it. But a lot of people do end up shaking the camera a little bit. So if you are hand holding your camera, just remember that your shutter speed should always be greater than 1 by focal length, whatever focal length you're shooting at. So let's say you are shooting with a 50 mm lens, then your shutter speed has to be higher than 1 by 50 second, right? So let's say you are shooting with a 200 mm lens, then your shutter speed has to be at least 1 by 200th of a second. Now let's say you're shooting with a crop sensor body, it's not a full frame, it's a crop sensor, so your crop factor will also come into play, and your focal length would be, your effective focal length, instead of let's say 50 mm on a full frame camera, would become like 75 mm on a crop sensor camera, right, depending on your crop factor. So in that case you have to consider your effective focal length. So let's assume I'm shooting with a 200 mm on a crop sensor body and the crop factor is 1.5, then it would essentially become a 300 mm lens. So then I need to ensure that my shutter speed is at least 1 by 300 and above. So there is no way you can set 1 by 300th of a second in your camera, so you should ideally set 1 by 400th of a second. So that is the rule of hand holding your camera. So in case if you're not getting sharp images, ensure that you shoot with a faster shutter speed. Now, what is the disadvantage to shooting in faster shutter speeds? One thing is, you may not always be able to achieve fast shutter speeds because maybe you're shooting indoors and you don't have a lot of light. Then you may want to slow down your shutter and allow more light to enter, right? So in such scenarios, instead of changing your shutter speed, you can consider opening up your aperture, or you can increase your ISO to compensate for that lack of light. But you have to ensure that your shutter speed, if you're hand holding your camera, you have to ensure that your shutter speed is at least 1 by focal length of your whatever focal length you're using. Okay, so now so far we've talked about freezing the motion. Now we'll talk about motion blur or blurring the motion, and when would you want to do that. So before that, let me just quickly check if there are any questions. Okay, so Girish is asking, how do I watch your previous sessions? You can go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Neeta Shankar. We've uploaded all the sessions over there, so you will be able to look at all the previous sessions as well. Okay, so Arindam is asking, is there any specific mode that's suitable better for wildlife photography? So you can use the aperture priority or shutter priority mode if you're doing wildlife photography, and if you're more comfortable with that. So I prefer to use the manual mode because that's what I have been comfortable with, and I prefer to have the complete control with me. In aperture priority, basically you set the aperture yourself, but the camera decides the shutter speed and ISO for you. And likewise in shutter priority, you can set the shutter speed yourself, whereas the camera decides the aperture and ISO values for you. So yeah, so you can whereas in manual mode you're setting all these three components by yourself, so you can decide what works for you. You can also use aperture priority and shutter priority if you're more comfortable with that. There's no hard and fast rule that it has to be manual all the time. Okay, so I don't see a lot of questions as of now, so let me continue. So we were talking about blurring the motion. So this is an example where you can see I framed the couple through the window of the car, of the moving car, and there is like a moving car and a moving scooter that has been blurred out. So this was an intentional shot, whereas I planned such that I wanted to frame the couple within moving vehicles because there were a lot of moving vehicles, and I wanted to get a nice motion blur on the moving vehicles. So here there are two things that you need to consider for such images. One is you're freezing your subject, which is your still subject, the couple, and then you're blurring the other elements in your frame. So all the moving elements have been blurred, whereas the still elements are frozen in time, right? So basically here all you need to consider is like what could be the speed of the car or the vehicles, and you need to probably if they are like going in like say maybe 50 km per hour or 60 km per hour, you would need a shutter speed of maybe like between 1/40th of a second to 1/60th of a second to get a nice motion blur on the vehicles, whereas at 1/60th of a second you can easily freeze the couple who are standing still. So here is another example of where you would use longer shutter speeds. When you're doing long exposure, especially when you have a lot of moving clouds, I like to do long exposures. So here I've done a long exposure to capture the movement of the clouds. Here the shutter speed would have been something around 30 seconds. And when you want to capture light trails, it could be light trails of moving vehicles, or it could be light trails of, here we've captured the light trail of the London Eye. So light trails are basically, say you can even do this with moving cars. Like for moving cars you would need something like maybe 3 to 4 seconds or maybe 5 seconds. Just imagine how much of time it requires for the subject to enter your frame and leave your frame, and you should be able to set your shutter speed accordingly. And when you're panning, so panning is a technique where you use a slightly slower shutter speed and you move along with your subject, with a moving subject, so that you get the illusion of that speed, where you can see that although the background looks like gives that illusion of speed, where your the background is all got that motion blur, whereas your subject is pretty much sharp. So how you do that is you change your focus mode to something which is continuously tracking your subject. So something like AI servo in Canon or AFC in Nikon is what you need to change it to. And while you're continuously tracking your subject, you need to move along with your subject and press the shutter. So that way you are capturing the motion of the background. I mean, the background looks like it's looks like that swift motion, and you get the subject pretty sharp. And you can also do bulb exposures. So basically when you're setting shutter speed in your camera, most cameras allow shutter speed up to 30 seconds on the lower side and up to 1/8000th of a second in the higher side. So anything beyond 30 seconds, if you want to set, there is an option called bulb mode in most of the professional cameras. So you can set it to bulb mode and keep it for as long as you want. So like for example, in this I've done a long exposure of 120 seconds because I wanted the motion of the clouds, which was, I wanted it to be captured across the whole frame, and the clouds were not moving very fast that day, so I wanted a really long exposure. And also I wanted all the people in the frame to get blurred out and vanish. That is one advantage of using longer shutter speeds. If there are a lot of tourists and you want to avoid them, you want to get only the place, if these tourists are like moving around, then you can use a really long exposure and their motion is not captured. So even though this beach was like really crowded that day, I hardly see a bunch of tourists. Whoever had sat down or whoever had stood in one place for that whole 120 seconds have been captured, but otherwise everyone else disappears because they have not stood in the same place for a long time to be captured on your frame. Okay. Then you can also create a lot of artistic blurs and a lot of creative effects by using longer shutter speeds. In this image we've just tried to in the night sky we've tried to illuminate the subject with flash, and at the same time used a long shutter speed and captured the captured some patterns with a sparkler. So you can even do this with a torch or any sort of other light source. You can just try light painting or making some patterns and things like that. So as you can imagine, experimenting with shutter speed is one of my most favorite techniques because you can get so much of creative shots when you are experimenting with longer shutter speeds. Okay, so going ahead, you can also use longer shutter speeds to shoot Milky Way. This was shot in Spiti Valley like 2 years ago. Or maybe 3 years ago, yeah. So when you want to shoot Milky Way, you need to shoot in places where there's absolutely no light pollution. So it has to be in the mountains, it can't be anywhere else. So there needs to be like zero light everywhere, and you need to be able to set your shutter speed for at least like 25 to 30 seconds to be able to capture the light of the stars. And you can also use longer shutter speeds to capture star trails. Although I haven't done a lot of star trails, but or I have done it, but I've not processed it yet. It's lying in some part of the hard drive. So here's one example where star trails is where when you set a long exposure and the relative distance of the star changes, relative position of the star changes, you get nice light trails because of that. So it's a really popular technique in landscape photography and night photography, and so that is something again you can achieve with longer shutter speeds. Okay, so that was about shutter speed. So let me just look at some of the questions that you may have. Yeah, so Tanmay is asking, some cameras like Z6 does have 5-axis image stabilization or vibration reduction. So, what he's trying to ask is like when I was talking about rule of hand holding your camera, I said you cannot use a shutter speed that is lower or slower than 1 by focal length whatever you're shooting at. So if you're shooting at 1 by say if you're shooting at 100 mm, your shutter speed had to be at least 1 by 100th of a second. Now if your camera has vibration reduction or in-body image stabilization, if your lens has vibration reduction or your camera has image stabilization, then you may get off. I mean, you can easily work around even with a slower shutter speed as well. So you don't always have to keep it at 1/100th of a second. You can also go down to like depending on how many stops of stabilization your camera allows, you can go down in your shutter speed. So like for example, this image was shot at around 1/15th of a second, which is a really slow shutter speed considering that I shot it handheld. So because my camera has inbuilt image stabilization, so I don't always need to follow the rule of hand holding. So if you are if your camera does not have in-body stabilization, then ensure that you get a shutter speed of at least 1 by focal length of whatever you're shooting. Okay, so Prasanna is asking, which metering mode do you need to use for wildlife photography? I would highly recommend using spot metering, because you can just meter your subject so that you get the exposure right for your subject, which is the wildlife, rather than for the entire scene. So only when I'm shooting landscapes, I would switch my metering mode to matrix metering. Otherwise, I'm always on spot. Okay, so Shantanu is asking, can you explain bulb mode shooting more? Do I need to use a remote for that? So some cameras allow you to set bulb exposures in your camera. Most professional cameras allow you to set bulb exposure in your camera. So right now I'm just reducing my shutter speed. The minute you go to the slowest shutter speed that my camera allows is 30 seconds, and beyond that, when you go beyond that, it shows bulb. So that means that you can set the exposure to bulb at that point. So how it works is, the minute in bulb, so when I focus, the minute I release the shutter, the exposure ends. So if I need this exposure to last for a long time, then I need to keep that shutter pressed for that much time. So obviously, if I'm shooting for 128 seconds, it's not practical for me to use that keep that shutter button pressed for like 120 seconds. So it would be good if you can get a shutter release or a remote. If you can get a shutter release. So you get cable shutter release for most of the cameras. You can just Google what model suits your camera, and you can decide. So now I've still kept the shutter pressed. If I release, now the shutter basically ended, the exposure basically ended once I took my finger off the shutter. So so in Z6 and Z7, apart from the bulb mode, there is also something called time mode. So generally, since I don't have a shutter release specifically for this, so I usually use the time mode, where I can basically once I focus, I click, the exposure starts, and then I can click again once my exposure is done, and it ends the exposure. So there are two different modes in Z6 and Z7, that is the bulb mode as well as time mode. So in other brands, there is usually just a bulb mode, so you need to get a shutter release for that. Okay, so Arindam is asking, for experiments like star trails, do you need any light source? You don't, because it's a long exposure and the stars are illuminated themselves, so you don't need another light source. But you can combine some star trail with some light painting of your own, and if there are some objects in your foreground that you want to light up, you can consider doing some light painting during your long exposure. So for light painting, it is preferable that you have a really dark space. Ananta is asking this. Yes, it is preferable to shoot in a darker space. But of course, if your shutter speed is not too long, if you don't require a very long shutter speed, then you can even do it in areas which is not very, very dark. Like you don't need, I mean, even with a lot of light pollution and stuff, you can still work for the light painting method. But of course, if you're shooting stars or Milky Way, then you definitely need to have to be in a place where there's absolutely zero light. Okay, so let me check if I missed any question. Okay, so the next topic is ISO. So we talked about how aperture affects light and depth of field. We talked about how shutter speed affects light as well as motion. And now we are talking about ISO. ISO basically refers to the sensitivity of your sensor towards light. So like I said before, exposure is nothing but the amount of light that's entering your lens and falling on your shutter, falling on your sensor depending on your shutter speed, and depending on how sensitive your your sensor is to light, it will determine how much of light is actually captured. So ISO is measured in numbers like 100, 200, 400, 600, 800 and things like that. So ISO is fairly simple. The minute you increase from 100 to 200, you're changing one stop, that is you're doubling the light. You increase from 200 to 400, you're doubling the light again. If you, let's say you move from 800 to 400, then you're cutting the light by half, so you've reduced a stop. So stops in ISO is like really simple. Like I said, 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600 and 3200. So if you have higher ISO numbers, that means you are allowing a lot more light to enter your camera. If you have really lower ISO numbers like 50 or 100, that means very little light is, basically your sensor is not very, very sensitive to light. So, okay. So just remember that higher the ISO number, more light, lesser the ISO number, less light. So ISO is the third parameter that you can set in your camera. So most often there is like an ISO button in your camera that you can press and hold, and then you can use one of the dials to change your ISO. Okay. So ISO affects light, that is fairly straightforward. ISO also affects detail. That is, if you increase your ISO to a very high number, like something like 1600 or 3200, the detail in your image is lost, because the sensor becomes so sensitive to light that it also becomes sensitive to noise and grain, and a lot of grain is captured in your image. So if you might have seen a lot of low light images look grainy and noisy in your phone or your camera, right? So that is because the camera is basically shooting in really high ISO, and at that point you're losing your detail. So if you want more detail in your images, and if you want, then you will have to shoot with a lower ISO. If you want, let's say there is no way you can manage with a lower ISO because of shooting in low light, then you can increase your ISO. Like say for example, now you let's say you're shooting a moving subject, you want to freeze the motion, so obviously you would set your shutter speed to something really fast, like say 1/200th of a second. 1/200th of a second is a really small fraction of time during which the light is entering your camera and falling on your lens, falling on your sensor. So obviously the light that is entering your sensor is really low, so you have to compensate in some other way. So either you can make your aperture wide open as in set it to a really low f number, whatever the lowest that your camera allows, your lens allows, and then you will be able to bring in more light instead of using a slower shutter speed. Or if you would prefer a really high depth, because aperture obviously influences depth of field. Now let's say you are shooting a subject that's moving and you want to freeze the subject, and also you want to get more depth and you don't want to bring down your aperture, you don't want to bring down your f number value, then you can increase your ISO to a higher value to make your sensor more sensitive to light. So that's how you decide what exactly you want in your picture, whether you want higher depth or you want faster shutter speeds to freeze the motion, or you can manage with slightly slower shutter speeds, or you can manage with wide open aperture, or if you cannot, if the light available is very low, then increase your ISO. So usually the way I work is I always ensure that ISO is the last thing that I change. So okay, we discussed all this. So here's one tip: don't shoot at really high ISO unless it's absolutely required. If you feel that the light is just not sufficient, even with a slower shutter speed or even with wide open aperture, if you're not able to work with decent ISO numbers, so like I wouldn't ever shoot beyond 3200, although my camera allows me to shoot up to 51,000 ISO, but I don't want to shoot higher ISO. When I don't want to shoot beyond a certain ISO level, ISO number, then I would ensure that my scene is lit with an external flash. Like for example, in this, when the sun is almost set, I've used an external flash to light the subject, so that way your subject also stands out, and the subject stands out from the background exposure, because obviously the exposure required to get the background right is much lesser in this case than the subject. So that is one thing. Otherwise, and also I don't want to just get the exposure right for the subject and then increase my ISO to an abnormal number. So I don't like to shoot in very high ISO. So I always keep it within 1600 or 3200 at the worst case. So preferably as low as possible. So if you're not able to achieve really if you're not able to achieve decent ISO numbers, that means that you need external lighting. Okay, so we did cover the full exposure triangle. So we figured out what's shutter speed, what's aperture, what's ISO. Aperture controls the depth of field and how much of light is entering your camera. It's the opening in your lens. So if you are using smaller f numbers, that means you are letting in more light and your depth of field is really shallow. If you are using higher f number, you are letting in very little light and your depth of field is much greater. And likewise for shutter speed, if you're shooting slower shutter speeds, you are allowing more light to enter your sensor. If your shutter speeds are really fast, then you're allowing less light to enter your sensor. So less light, that is faster shutter speeds, freeze the motion, slower shutter speeds blur the motion. And with ISO, lower the ISO number, less light, the sensor is less sensitive to light. Higher the ISO number, sensor is more sensitive to light, and it's better to keep the ISO less, because then you have more detail in your frame, and if your ISO is really high, then you start to see a lot of noise. So that's all you need to remember about the exposure triangle. It's fairly simple. Okay. So let me just see if I have any questions. Okay, so Priyanka is asking any tips to shoot silhouette. So basically, if you want to shoot silhouette, you need a brighter background compared to your subject, like say a bright sky, or say in this scenario, if I had just not used the external light, the subjects would have become a silhouette, because I've got the exposure right for the background. So when you're shooting silhouette, all you need to remember is to get the exposure right for the background rather than your subject, and always place your subject against a brighter background. So Arindam is asking about bracketing, metering and white balance. I will be covering that in the last session, that is the next coming session. Okay, so Arindam is asking, for landscape or wildlife, what ISO would you suggest? It's irrespective of what you're shooting. Your ISO has to be the least number that is possible. If at all there is no light and you want to increase your ISO, do it up to 1600, maybe not more than that. Maybe up to 3200 if your camera is good at noise handling. So Shantanu is asking, at 100 ISO I got noise, what may be the reason? I don't think that would be noise. It could be probably dust. There's no way you can get noise at 100 ISO unless you've underexposed your image drastically and then recovered it in post. You would not see noise at 100 ISO. Okay, so Shanit is asking how to take panning photo. Like I said, change your focusing mode to continuous focus, and while you're tracking your moving subject, so if your subject is moving this way, you should always be tracking the subject and then let go of the shutter button at the end of the motion. So track your subject's motion for a while and then let go. Use a slow shutter speed according to the speed of your subject. Let's say if it is a moving car, it could be, you can pan at anything like 1/60th of a second, or if it's a really fast moving car, you can even pan at 1/100th of a second. So it all depends on the speed of the car. So let's say typically for most of the moving vehicles, it should be like say 1/50th of a second or something like that. Okay, so yeah, so Shantanu is saying he got noise in the shadow area. If you are trying to recover details in shadow areas and your camera doesn't have a good enough dynamic range, obviously you will see noise. So shadows are meant to be there for a purpose. Like every image needs to have some light and some shadow. Like say for example, this is shadow area in this image. Now if I want to like completely brighten this up and make it look like it has got all the detail, then you will see noise. So if your image does not have, if your camera does not have a lot of dynamic range in extreme shadow areas and you try to recover shadows, you may see some noise. Okay. Okay, so I think I've answered most of the questions. So that's what we had today. Just quickly going over how I would set exposure, although I'll talk about it again tomorrow. So first thing, whenever I'm calculating an exposure, first thing that I do is first I decide what is my subject, how do I highlight the subject, do I want to use shallow depth of field and bring the subject as in isolate the subject from the background, or do I want to use greater depth of field, like maybe in landscapes or architecture. Do I want to use, do I want to freeze the motion? Is there motion in the frame? Do I want to freeze the motion, or do I want to blur the motion? Is there enough light? Do I need to use a higher ISO or lower ISO? So these are the questions I ask myself before I take a picture. So it becomes like second nature once you are used to shooting, but of course initially you can just ask yourself these questions. So let's say I'm shooting this little scooter on my desk. So first thing that I would do is I'll probably want to use shallow depth of field. Otherwise, everything that's there in the office may come into focus and may not really, stand out from against the cluttered background. So if I want to, get a shallow depth of field, so first I'll set my aperture. So this is a 1.8 lens. It's a 24 1.8. So I'll set the f number to 1.8. Like I said yesterday, aperture, the depth of field is influenced by three factors. One is the f number, keep it as low as possible. Another, ensure the distance between camera and subject and is much lower than subject and the background. So the background is pretty far, so I think I'm good to go with that. So once I set my aperture, next thing, of course, the third factor is that the focal length also influences depth of field, but in this it's a wide angle lens, but it's okay because the distance between the subject and my lens, my camera is quite less. So I know in spite of me shooting on a wide angle lens, I will get a nice depth of field, shallow depth of field. So once I set my f number, I then decide what what kind of a shutter speed I need to set. First of all, it's night time. It is we have indoor light setup, but still it may not be a lot of light. So I'll set the shutter speed. Like I had mentioned, I would want to use a shutter speed at least which is greater than 1 by focal length. Right now I'm on 24 mm, so I'm good. So even if I use say 1 by 50th of a second, I should be fine. So I'll set the shutter speed to 1 by 50th of a second, and then depending on how much of light is available, I'll decide whether I want to increase my ISO or not. So basically the way you set your exposure is, there is something called a meter in your camera which has a scale, and it shows 0, -1, -2, +1, +2. So just find the meter. Like if you're looking through the viewfinder, you should be able to see your meter, or sometimes it is even displayed on the LCD if you're looking through the LCD. Now say if I'm looking at the LCD, the meter is displayed here in my camera where it says 0, -1, -2, +1, +2, +3, like that. So if I'm looking through the viewfinder, I again see the meter. So when I'm focusing on my subject, I constantly look at the meter, and if the meter shows 0, that means the camera thinks that is like the right exposure for your scene. So basically that's how you calculate exposure. Like first decide what your aperture and shutter speed values should be, and then set your ISO according to the light that is available in the room. So when I'm taking the shot, if the meter shows -1 or -2, then I will change my ISO, increase my ISO until I see that the meter is showing me 0, right? So let's say if the meter is showing me +1 or +2 or +3, whatever, that means that the scene has a lot of light, and with my current settings the scene will get overexposed. So then I'll need to either reduce my ISO or increase my shutter speed and bring down that light so that I can get a correct exposure. So in order to get the correct exposure, you need to bring your camera meter to 0. We will talk about this in detail in tomorrow's session. So tomorrow we are also talking about white balance. We are talking about different metering modes and how that affects how your camera calculates the exposure, and I'll answer any of your closing questions tomorrow. So don't forget to tune in tomorrow. So I think today we've run out of time. So I'll see you all tomorrow on Instagram, and we'll continue this session. And tomorrow's session will be the last. So make sure you're there, and if you have any questions, make sure you ask me tomorrow. So see you all tomorrow at 7 p.m. and yeah, so have a great day.